Good afternoon. My name is Ananya Kumar. I'm the Deputy Director for Future of Money at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. I'm here today at our IMF studios to join everyone here for a lively conversation. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. We're going to talk about digital infrastructures in practice, some lessons from implementation. I'm joined by a distinguished group of panelists, some of whom are returnees, some of whom have been in many conversations with me before. Thank you all for joining us. Today I'm joined by Tim Murphy, Vice Chair at Mastercard, where he's also worked for over 2 decades. Justin Sherman, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative and the CEO of Global Cyber Strategies. And Sabine Mensah, Deputy CEO of the AfricaNenda Foundation. Thank you all for joining me, and let's get started. Tim, it seems like we've entered an advanced phase of implementation when it comes to digital infrastructure, especially as it relates to payments and identities. The question that a lot of countries, that people at the World Bank and IMF this week seem to be asking is not whether we should implement and digitize infrastructure, it's what kind of digital infrastructure fits for my purposes. Have you noticed this across the geographies that you work in? And what do you think are some of the evolving policy gaps and opportunities as both advanced economies and emerging markets do this?
So it's a terrific question. And I'd say I completely agree with the premise that you started with, which is the question is not if nations will invest in digital infrastructure, it's very much how, at what pace, and what kind of frameworks they want to build. So the need continues to be great. Over 2.5 billion people still don't have access to the internet, and certainly basic financial services. We've made a lot of progress. There's a lot more to do. I think in terms of policy gaps, Mastercard works in 210 countries around the world. We've got not just card payments, but we help partner with governments to drive all sorts of payments and economies. And from the payment standpoint, I'd point to, I think, 2 things. One is, I think there has not been a sufficiently rich conversation about the role of the private sector in these digital transformation initiatives, whole of government, whole of nation. We, as you would expect, have a strong view that the private sector can drive a lot of innovation. Nations can drive nation or population scale changes, but private sector can play a role of that as well. We'd like that to be enriched, and I think that's something we'll talk about as we go forward. But beyond that, we're also seeing really worrisome trends in terms of the fragmentation of the world and the challenges around cooperation. That clearly is a major theme at World Bank and IF meetings this year, and we really risk nations investing in digital infrastructures that then become digital islands, and how, while cross-border data flows are a tough issue that raise a lot of policy questions, we think it's really important that that remains front and center so we don't create islands and we create the real value of international cooperation in this space.
Thank you. And it always takes about 5 minutes for us to raise the issue of fragmentation and interoperability
in
this conversation. So I'm glad you started there. But Justin, you were here last year having a similar conversation. You'd published a paper with us on cyber and privacy threats and existing digital infrastructure. Can you give us a few of your relevant recommendations from that research, and then tell me if you've changed your mind about anything from 6 months ago?
Yeah, this was part of a track 2, as you referenced, that we ran at Atlantic Council on DPI, and I sort of ran the cyber and privacy slice. I think some things have changed since then, certainly, right? We've seen even more increased interest in artificial intelligence deployment. How does that intersect with DPI? What can we do with the insights, the data? As Tim noted, fragmentation has been another big piece that's shifted. So some of the sands are moving, so to speak. But on the fundamentals, I don't think much has changed. We're still looking at how do you ensure that governments can build infrastructure that's not just resilient and secure, but trusted, right? How do you have the transparency mechanisms, have the audits, have the opportunity for third-party vetting that goes into that? Talking about security, right? How do we make sure that systems are not too contingent on one particular developer or one particular government architecture, right? This is a huge problem in a lot of countries. They'll build out a payment system, an ID matching system, and use one system built by a state agency that's not going to be resilient. And the third thing I'll mention is back to something Tim said with public-private, right? And we've seen in that study and still today a lot of emphasis on what can governments do, as was just noted. I do think we also, much like we should worry about concentrating too much in one company, we also should worry about concentrating too much in one government. And that's going to be a challenge, I think, in the coming years.
Yeah, the theme of public-private collaboration and what's an effective model to make that work is clearly emerging from both of your comments. Sabine, I want to turn to you. You're seeing a lot of this digitization happen in real time. Have you seen policy goals of the people that you interact with evolve over time? And where do you see the most need for an organization like AfricaNenda?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. First of all, let me say that AfricaNenda is a non-for-profit foundation, and we are dedicated to scale inclusive instant payment systems in Africa, working with a broad range of stakeholders, central banks, regulators, government agencies, and the private sector. Now, of course, in our implementation at the country level, policy goals have evolved in Africa. For one thing, I would like to talk about the enabling and facilitating a level playing field between banks and non-banks in the ecosystem. You know, in the past, traditionally, central banks were focused on institutional licenses, whether you're a bank, a microfinance institution, a scheme player, so forth. What we've seen is that the evolution of the industry, the recognition of the role that mobile money and mobile financial services can play in the ecosystem, a lot of central banks have moved towards activity-based licensing, risk-based approach to licensing, which is great news for our ecosystem because it really enables more players to come into that ecosystem, more competition for the benefit of the poor and the end banks that are in that ecosystem. So I think that's a tremendous shift that I've seen on the policy side from a payments perspective. And from an identity perspective, a lot of interest also in investment in digital identity as part of the deep digital public infrastructure building blocks certainly is happening in Africa. I think one of the challenges we see there is that the digital identity projects are led by ministries involved in identity and not necessarily inclusive of other stakeholders, the likes of financial regulators, the financial service provider, who are by default the users of the digital identity ecosystem. So I think that's an area where I see there's more opportunities for inclusive collaboration and consultation and making sure that there's a digital public infrastructure strategy that's holistic at a country level and involving all the different stakeholders. So our role in that ecosystem is really, first of all, enabling more transparency in what's happening on the payment system, sharing the strengths of the implementation in Africa, and of course, where the opportunities are, and also providing tools for the ecosystem to leverage on. And a couple tools will include the State of Inclusive Instant Payment System report that we do annually, and we are the 4th edition. And I hope you will join us in the launch of that report later on in November. And another thing is that we're working with several agencies, the like of DIAL, CDPI, and BTCA to develop a roadmap playbook for DPI roadmap playbook for countries, so that you don't have to start from scratch.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And the larger point you bring up there, which is that this is a collaborative effort, and there's a lot of work that is ongoing that we can take learnings from, is really important. That's something that we see happen at the IMF World Bank meeting quite a bit, which is why I enjoy coming here and talking about these topics. The other issue we've all brought up is the issue of trust and resilience in payment systems, and as an anchor of digital systems. Tim, as you're talking to governments and businesses abroad, how is maintaining and enhancing trust coming up, whether it is governments and centralization of power there, or a few maybe monopolistic or duopolistic companies, and what's missing from that conversation that's had on trust and resilience?
So I think a couple of things. I think, frankly, you've already touched on it, which is the trust. The payments component of any digital infrastructure is fundamentally, it's a people business, and in front of all of the technology, in front of all the rules, all of the geopolitics, people will feel trust to use a product if it's the right product for them, if they know their privacy is protected. Our research says that sort of so-called last-mile consumers care about privacy just as much as you and I, and if they know that they will be protected from fraud. And so I just think those things absolutely remain essential. I think they do need to be elevated in a richer way in the policy conversation. I think it's why your report, frankly, is so important. I think the point I would make is that once you invest in world-class cybersecurity, privacy protections, and others, there are cost implications. And again, here there may be differences of opinion around the table, but our view would be there is a cost to quality, and while nations should debate this, and contexts will be different in different countries, and my point of view coming into that debate would be, let's make sure there's enough economic incentives in the ecosystems so that people can invest in quality for consumers. And I'm struck by how much, when I'm talking to regulators in the UK and the United States, the laser focus they have on how we're conducting ourselves is what is the quality and the resilience of the service you're providing consumers. The DPI conversation is often about cost/free. There's some place in the middle these need to intersect.
There's also, the point that you bring up, they're going to look very different for different kinds of markets, and depending on the kind of players that exist in that
100%,
market.
100%.
Justin, because Tim's brought up privacy and cybersecurity, I mean, there's two aspects to this, right? There's a certain amount of privacy protection and risk management that everyone needs to do, and then there is a need for greater transparency and efficiency, often at odds with each other. Yeah. How do you see that happen? Because I know your report talks about this as well.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, as you were just getting at, right, in figuring out how to balance. I'll also say, too, right, I mean, I'm not a pure payments person either, and so I even think of DPI more broadly, right, identity management systems, and I know we're all touching on these things, too, but just to illustrate, right, it's a lot broader, all of which, as you're saying, come with complex privacy questions. And so I think, again, if we look in a country-specific context, there are all kinds of incentives we could unpack of who wants to collect or use data in which ways, how do they do it. I think if we zoom out, though, there actually is a lot of incentive, and I argue this in that paper after our Track 2 program, for companies to actually implement some of these privacy and trust protections across markets, because if you are viewed as the operative of XYZ government building all their infrastructure, who on earth is going to hire you, and many countries have expressed this, to do their own, right? Yeah. They worry about espionage, they worry about market dependency and all kinds of other things. So all to say, I think, as you said, it's a tricky balance. You could look at cybersecurity, as Tim just said, and there are reasons why more data flows across the system, longer retention periods, increase cybersecurity risks, such as if there's a breach. There are also lots of reasons that you need to collect that data to do fraud detection, to do identity verification, to be able to have telemetry on threat actors. I mean, the list goes on, and so I think I'd say two things. One is the cross-border data flows piece here is huge, which is as there's more tension, we'll say, around this, as the US and EU get into it, and some of the long-standing agreements are currently collapsing. That's going to be a real issue for ensuring that right balance of data use and security. The second thing is then within countries, I still think we're seeing a strong sovereignty push. Right. It's not always, though, about surveillance or other things. It sometimes is about countries wanting more control over cloud contracts. Like I had all these conversations in Latin America last year, all these large, big spenders in different countries who felt that they couldn't even get, I won't name the cloud provider, but to tweak some of the terms in the agreement. So I think getting at the underlying motives maybe can tie us back to these broader DPI objectives. Where are those misalign? Maybe where can we loosen some of those constraints?
Yeah, thank you. Sabine, I want to have your take on the privacy conversation, because as Tim alluded, there's a sense that emerging markets don't really care about their consumers' privacy. That's obviously not true. Can you play that out a little bit for us?
Absolutely. In the context of the CIPS report, we do consumer research every year, about 4 or 5 countries, and systematically one of the things that came up is the concerns that unbanked and or underserved consumer voice about their data, what is done with it, who has access to it, how is it used, and sometimes what we're really seeing is that the trust factor into the digital ecosystem is threatened by the fact that people are scared of what can be done with their data and who has access to it, and how is this going to be coming back to them, quote unquote, in a way. So I think it's important for us to collectively work on building trust in the digital payment ecosystem, but also educating consumers about their rights and what is done in terms of privacy and data and how this is used, so that we all understand what our rights are, but we hold the financial service providers, the platform operators, accountable for what we say the regulation is about privacy, and yet at the same time providing a service we can trust. Otherwise, we risk that people revert back to cash while we're still building that digital ecosystem.
Yeah, let me double click on another bit of the conversation that we talked about, which is building interoperability. As you're talking to different kinds of actors within ecosystems, how are you thinking about actually reducing friction, not creating more by having digital islands?
Well, thank you. I was going to build on the digital island that you had mentioned earlier, Tim. Well, let me answer that by giving you a bit of the landscape in Africa. On the payment side, we have mapped out in 2024 31 instant payment systems in Africa. 28 of them are domestic, so at a country level, and 3 are regional, enabling cross-border in sub-regions in Africa. Out of these 31 systems, only 14 enable all-to-all interoperability, so not even half. Only 14 of these systems are enabling, all-to-all interoperability. If I'm a poor and I live in a region and I'm having my wallet or my account with provider A, my mother's provider B, my sister's provider C, and I have the whole village to whom I'm sending money, it becomes complex if you're poor. There's no reason for any of us to have several accounts. So what we're looking at is one account that enables interaction with the entire financial ecosystem, and that is interoperability. What we've seen in Africa is that some regulators have taken a stand by mandating interoperability. In other markets, the private sector came together and really pushed for the interoperability to happen. But it is critical that it happens because from a convenience perspective, from a consumer perspective, the pie gets bigger when it's interoperable for all of us, and we have more access and more usage of digital services.
Thank you, and I'm glad you brought up the regulatory point here. That's from sort of the state perspective. Tim, I want to go back to you because in some ways your business is the business of interoperability, and from your perspective, how do you create that in either new markets or markets that are rapidly digitizing?
So I think I agree with everything that's been said here. The interoperability is absolutely essential to drive scale and value and usage and, frankly, simplicity for consumers. So from our standpoint, our core business has always been deeply embedded in the principle of interoperability. There's a space for private companies to come together and agree standards for interoperability, and we certainly do that. But I think there's also a role for government to enhance interoperability, hopefully using common standards that industry can agree on as well. And so I kind of go back to, I think it's a public-private partnership conversation. How can government set standards for private players to be interoperable and then hold them to account to do that work, not just on existing payments and identity platforms, but on the new innovations of the future, whether that's AI-driven agentic commerce or a new instant payment system being built in a country. I also think practically we will see the emergence, as we're seeing in Africa, of regional leaders who will work to help knit together ecosystems beyond their existing countries and beyond one country. And so I suspect one way at the interoperability issue will be the emergence of regional leaders who drive more of that.
Yeah, and that's certainly true in Latin America and
100%.
South Asia in terms of the payments context. That's right. I want to turn to sort of us being here at the IMF and World Bank throughout this week. So there's ongoing work, obviously, at the IMF and World Bank on digital transformation. There's work happening in the G20 through the payments working group and through different tracks of digital transformation. And there's work happening in ASEAN. Justin, I'll turn over to you first. Where have you seen impact happening across any of these fora, and what does that impact look like? Where is there more work to be done?
Yeah, I'm going to just be really boring and say definitions and standards. But the first thing, right, is definitions. And this is where I think, whether it's the UN or OECD, I mean, we can go through all the various acronyms, but places where countries may agree on paper to different concepts that sometimes have great value, right, and great meaning when it comes to technical implementation. Like, we want resilient infrastructure, or we want people to have data portability, right, to enable that interoperable moving between services, consumers picking what best serves them. There are other places where the definitions I don't think are too meaningful, right? Countries saying things like, we want take your pick, responsible state control of elements of the stack, right? Or we want to make sure government gets access to the back end system, right? those things mean very different things in very different legal, political, social contexts. And so, the principle that's agreed to, I think, has less meaning when the rubber hits the road for what different countries are going to pursue. But I also mentioned standards, right? This is a huge area where I think, as we were just talking about, having organizations come together across regions, but also across DPI areas, maybe payments in conversation with agentic commerce or identity management, right, or whatever it is, to talk about what are those existing standards, whether I'm going to be boring again, ISO, IEEE, whatever they are that are out there, or new things we need to come up with, because maybe it's AI overlaid with some payments pipeline that we've never seen before, and there's a new thing we have to agree to. So I'd say, the more that we can drive practical definitions and standards, I think the better off everyone will be.
No, that's exactly right. And this is a challenge we come to when we research these questions, which is that when I say fast payments, I could really mean anything that moves fast enough.
Yeah.
And countries and businesses understand it in a different way. Similarly, when we say digital ID, do we mean some sort of verifiable credential? How is that credentialing going to happen? How is it trustworthy? I think you're definitely right on the definitions and standards portion. Sabine, I have the same question for you. Where do you think there's been most impact in multilateral fora, and where is there more work to be done?
I want to talk about cross-border, enabling seamless cross-border payments. I think the G20 roadmap on enabling cross-border payment has definitely brought more stakeholder focus on what can be done on cross-border payments. Right. And of course, I'm part of the BIS CPMI working group on payments interoperability expansion, and seen a lot of production of documents on how to interlink fast payment systems and what's needed in the ecosystem. I appreciate, how this work is helping the ecosystem evolve on this thematic. I also appreciate the work that's being done by Project Nexus in trying to find solutions for multilateral interlinking of ISPS to enable cross-border payment in the ASEAN region. So I think those are all progress that we are seeing, and in the ecosystem in Africa, we're looking at seeing how we can learn from these lessons and be able to build it, because where we stand in Africa is that we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that opens up a market of more than 1.4 billion people to MSMEs, and there is no trade without cross-border payments. Intra-Africa trade is built on cross-border payments, so I would like to make a call really to the regulators in Africa and policymakers to come together and put a payment service directive for Africa that's going to enable passporting of licenses, that's going to enable more innovation in cross-border payment in Africa to sustain the ambition of the AFCFTA.
No, thank you. And a call to action on a panel is always great. Tim, over to you. Where have you seen impact, and what more needs to be done?
I'd echo some of the things that have already been said. I think the G20 work's been critical. UNDP has been very helpful. I think we welcome the recent World Bank report and the World Bank and IMF engagement. Frankly, I think these institutions, World Bank and IMF, are critical places to continue the dialogue, and the power of convening here is great. I want to go back to the standards comment. There's so much work to do on practical standards to drive interoperability across government and commercial enterprises, cross-border, across the various elements of a DPI stack, that I think that's absolutely essential, and it's getting the standards right to allow for the right level of government oversight and control as a nation determines, with private sector innovation. It's critical. When you think about agentic commerce, this is an AI-driven agent automating payments in our world. The number of standards you need to write to make sure that protects the consumer, like when can I trust a bot and when can I not, that's really creative, hard work that needs to be done, hasn't been done yet. These are places where that work needs to happen if these are going to enable commerce in a meaningful way. All of that tells me, this is my main, the private sector has to be at the table. And my call to action to World Bank and IMF is bring the private sector in for these conversations in the right way, because private sector has done a terrific job, at least in my industry over the years, in my view, in setting standards that have created a lot of value for a lot of consumers and small businesses.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, there's a certain siloization of people who study the governance of these networks and people who do the technical work of actually implementing them. And maybe there's a bringing together here that needs to happen. So thank you all for saying that. This is my last question. We're coming up to the U.S.'s G20 G20 presidency, and this is coming up after 4 years of emerging market presidencies, right? So presidencies get to set an agenda of digital transformation that works for them, that works specifically for their market. We're going to see a transition from emerging market presidencies to an advanced economy presidency, of course, in a time of transition in the U.S. and tumult here as well. Does this opportunity of a U.S. G20 presidency present a way for us to articulate what a Western vision for payments needs to be or could be? Tim, over first to you, and then we'll go down the table.
I'll just be really quick. It could. I actually think the U.S.'s track record on digital innovation, including inclusive innovation, is in some respects better than it sometimes gets credit for. I think often it gets reduced to sound bites, and I hear colleagues around the world saying, yes, Americans have traded privacy for access and services. In some respects, yes. I think in financial services, the industry's actually done a tremendous job protecting privacy. Right. So I think there's opportunities to talk about the elements of the U.S. model and how I think they've been successful. I think there's a chance to talk about cyber and a chance to talk about AI-driven innovation. So and I think there's a chance for the U.S. to lead on the role of private sector driving some of these things. We'll see how that all plays out, but I do hope there's a chance for a candid, a comprehensive assessment of U.S. progress or not, and what that might be helpful to share with the wider world.
Thank you. Sabine, over to you, and really contextualize this coming from an African G20 presidency. We're starting a new cycle over. So
I am hopeful.
Yeah.
I think the G20 platform has been really great in elevating digitization agenda, digital public infrastructure, and I do hope that the U.S. presidency will continue, leveraging this platform for enriching discussions and learning for the entire world in terms of technology. Whether it does that or not, that's $1 million question.
Justin, over to you.
I wish we had our crystal ball.
Yeah.
Yeah, I echo everything that was just said. I think two things, right? One is, again, when we think about the spectrum of different technologies that are being discussed, but again, think 10 years out could be discussed as part of DPI, we're not only talking about those couple U.S. tech firms that rightly or wrongly, and I have my own thoughts, but create sentiments around privacy or other things, right? We're talking about a wide spectrum of companies, financial services, healthcare, AI companies, cloud, telecom, right, that could be involved in those components. So that's the first thing. The second piece is I think the more that the potential positive the U.S. could bring to the table is that perspective, I think, rooted almost in internet history, right, of the government in the United States, a little bumpy at different points, but generally put a lot of money in up front, and there was some standard setting and so forth, but over time it's been private sector, internet firms, standard setting, academic collaborations, telecoms, not heavy-handed government involvement that has actually driven connectivity expansion, cybersecurity innovation. I just think there are places there where the analogy historically could, again, if things went well, carry over to a new U.S. approach to DPI.
Thank you, and that's the last word for today. So thanks so much for doing this, and thank you all for joining me today. Please join me at 4 p.m. for another conversation on payments titled Beyond Speed. Until then, bye.